Larian Studios and Baldur's Gate 3 are picking up all of the awards at the moment. However, the response from other devs has been mixed. There are plenty that have congratulated them, raised their glasses to Larian. However, some are running scared. They are making excuses, suggesting that Baldur's Gate 3 shouldn't be a raised standard for the RPG genre. This is going to come to a head because in 2024, there are a number of RPGs releasing, and so many of them are going to look utterly mediocre in comparison to Baldur's Gate 3. Today we're going to talk about 3 role-playing games that are coming out in the next 12 months or so that perhaps would have gotten a pass in years prior, but they are not going to cut it in a post-Baldur's Gate 3 world. Let's start with Avowed. It is an Obsidian Entertainment game that is due to come out in 2024, and this is the studio that brought us games like The Outer Worlds, or in better times, Fallout New Vegas. Avowed was originally presented as Obsidian's answer to Skyrim. It was originally presented as a first-person RPG set in a vast world within the Pillars of Eternity setting. A series that was interestingly created as a spiritual successor to the original Baldur's Gate games. Obsidian as a studio have always had problems though. They've often had to make their games on a tight deadline, and this has meant much of their creativity and ambition has been severely impacted by budgets as well as time constraints, preventing them from making a genuine epic in the vein of a Baldur's Gate 3, which could be seen as Larian's magnum opus. Avowed itself was originally sold to us as this huge open-world Skyrim-like, and yet around the time of the official gameplay reveal earlier this year, they started talking about how it was going to be a little bit more like The Outer Worlds. Now, The Outer Worlds is an interesting one because I firmly believe if it came out today, it would have gotten more of a Starfield-like reception where people would see the flaws, the lack of genuine passion, and just the by-the-numbers nature of it, but because it released in 2019, it basically got a free pass. Those were the days where RPG developers like Bioware were turning to live services instead, like Anthem, and single-player RPGs, they were few and far between. Most people were happy to just get anything at all. They weren't really too picky, and that just isn't the case these days. With Baldur's Gate 3 selling 20 plus million copies, RPG fans, they've got all of the hand now. Publishers and developers, they cannot pull the old line of, oh, gamers, they only want live services these days, that they're not interested in story-driven experiences. Come on, give us your money. Gamers have shown that they will get out there. They will buy a genuinely great role-playing game if it is put in front of them. The excuse just cannot be used that the genre isn't mainstream enough, and therefore publishers, they can only afford to put up small budgets, hire inexperienced teams. It is not the case anymore. Avowed is a perfect example of this. It sounds like it has been downgraded since its initial reveal, specifically its world size and its open nature. While their excuse was that they wanted to focus on other areas of the game, I just think that after Outer Worlds, it's hard to believe them. That game did not have the scope of an open world holding it back, instead choosing to focus on hub areas more akin to games like Mass Effect and Dragon Age Origins, and despite all of that, it didn't really excel at anything. Avowed's gameplay also just underwhelmed. It was an example of a game that had people excited initially, but the more people saw of it, the more people lost interest. The animations, the characters, the combat, it all just looked somewhat mediocre and had absolutely nothing to really grab people's attention. Meanwhile, Baldur's Gate 3 built up excitement extremely early with the early access release, and it was constantly looking at ways to innovate rather than look at ways to just cut corners. An example being the third-person camera angles during dialogue that was rarely seen in similar games at the time. If Avowed is genuinely coming in 2024, it's going to get torn to shreds if it isn't Obsidian's best game in years. A middling affair, an 8 out of 10, that will be seen as a 5 out of 10 for fans of the genre, who've had expectations raised after Baldur's Gate. and it's something that both Obsidian and Microsoft, they really need to think about. Microsoft seems to see their studios as Game Pass fodder to an extent, focusing on quantity instead of quality, releasing games that you can only justify checking out if you're playing them as part of an existing subscription. These games, they don't always stand on their own 2 feet, and you just feel ripped off if you bought them at full price. Starfield being a perfect example of that. For now, Avowed is best approached with some skepticism. I don't think it'll be a terrible game, but they haven't been able to show us anything that suggests it will be special. And it needs that if it's going to stand out against games like Baldur's Gate 3. I do want to talk about Dragon Age Dreadwolf now, because if there are concerns around Avowed, then this one is in an even more dire state. On the topic of Baldur's Gate, the Dragon Age series is an odd one. The series actually only exists because Bioware, the dev, created Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 back in the late 90s, early 2000s. However, they wanted to make their own IP, move away from the world of Dungeons & Dragons, and thus Dragon Age Origins was born as a spiritual successor. I do have a lot of respect for older Bioware, as they kept the RPG genre alive during a late 2000s era when consoles had taken over and everything was action, action, action. It was difficult to find a slow-paced role-playing game during that time, but Dragon Age Origins, it did prove that they still had a place. The problem was, it all went downhill. Dragon Age 2 was a rushed mess thanks to EA wanting it out the door, and Dragon Age Inquisition, despite being praised at the time, it has left people with a sour taste over the years, with many seeing it as more of an MMO light rather than a traditional RPG. There are even rumours that it was actually born out of a potential Dragon Age MMO that was then recrafted into a single-player game as time went on. With the series in a tough spot, Bioware returned to Mass Effect, which had been a more consistent series for them, but the self-proclaimed magic was gone, and their teams put out consecutive stinkers in Mass Effect Andromeda and then the live service Anthem mentioned earlier. They were chasing the live service trend with Anthem, and themselves and EA were hoping it was going to bring in that FIFA-like money. It just didn't happen. With multiple series ruined, Dragon Age was perhaps the least damaged, and that leads us to Dreadwolf, Dragon Age 4, likely Bioware's last chance. If they cannot deliver with this, it seems likely that EA may close or significantly restructure them, and Mass Effect 5, which they did recently tease, it might never happen if this ends up being the case. What we know of Dreadwolf is that it originally started as a title with live service elements. This almost always sets off alarm bells for me, but somewhere along the line, Bioware realised that live service games, they were no longer a guaranteed success, and instead they have tried to pivot back to a more single-player focused experience. There were leaks suggesting a God of War-like combat style to go along with this new single-player focused path, but the success of Baldur's Gate 3, it's actually created a real irony in all this. As mentioned, this is the studio that created the original Baldur's Gate video games. They moved away from all that, they chased other industry trends, and yet the very series that they created has now just had its most successful entry. One of the best games, not just of the year, but of all time. This is despite the fact that it was created by a different studio, and also it was released as a classic role-playing game. It didn't try and be something else, look at what was popular in the mainstream. It focused on its pure strengths, and gamers rewarded them for it. It seems very likely that Dragon Age Dreadwolf will desperately try and leech off the success of Baldur's Gate 3, perhaps pivoting once again to try and be a more traditional RPG, perhaps changing up the combat once again and going all in on the Baldur's Gate influence. What I can guarantee is that when they're marketing this game, they will not be hyping up their Dragon Age experience so much, but instead you will see on the box or in the ads from the creators of Baldur's Gate. It'll be somewhere in there if they're allowed to, which will no doubt be EA and Bioware trying to ride off the coattails of Baldur's Gate 3 rather than their own recent games. If there was ever a game to not be excited for, it would be Dreadwolf. This is a game with zero direction. It has tried to chase multiple industry trends, and when all you do is follow, you eventually get left behind, and that is what has happened to Bioware. They were once industry leaders, they now pale in comparison to studios like Larian, and I'm expecting a total fail, and perhaps the end of a once great studio. Lastly, I want to talk about Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. This is the sequel to an RPG that has similar levels of respect and admiration to the original Baldur's Gate games. If this game had have had a competent development team, given it's got a very unique setting for RPGs, this sequel could have gone very far. The issue is that the entire story of this game can be described in 2 words: sheer incompetence. Paradox Interactive, the publisher, they are mostly known for their grand strategy games, but they also have some RPG studios under their belt, such as Harebrained Schemes, who created a trilogy of Shadowrun RPGs in the mid-2000s. Harebrained Schemes, they aren't with Paradox now, but they were when this game started development. Despite all of this, they actually gave the development duties of this new Bloodlines game to a studio that had zero RPG experience at all, a studio called Hardsuit Labs. Now, all of this started out fine. The original creator of Bloodlines, Brian Mitsoda, he was brought on board and was heavily involved with this project. He had other passionate people around him as well. However, the leadership of this studio, the management, they were described as a mixed bag, and despite the early promise, things soon turned from positive to downright sad and embarrassing. While they were able to present some decent-looking gameplay footage to the general public, including conversations that looked to be full of choice, consequence, there was a presentation style that did look similar to the acclaimed original game. Despite all that, things were not going well behind the scenes. We may never know exactly what happened, but rumors heavily suggest that the studio's management were deceiving their publisher. They were promising features that were never actually built, and they were diverting a lot of the budget and resources that Paradox, the publisher, were giving them. They were putting this money towards other completely separate games. They were essentially ripping off the publisher of Bloodlines 2. Whether it was illegal or not, I don't know, but this is supposedly what was going on. Development internally appeared to also be breaking down, with Brian Mitsoda, the original creator I mentioned earlier, being fired. And it became clear that their lack of RPG experience meant that they simply weren't capable of making any sort of functioning role-playing game. Now, you would have thought that was the end of the story. Development was cancelled and the game world moved on. But sadly, this train wreck isn't over. It continued. Development was instead outsourced to a Sumo Digital studio, the Chinese Room, who were known at the time for their walking simulators, such as Everybody's Gone to the Rapture and Amnesia, A Machine of Pigs. Basically adventure games with not a lot of gameplay. Once again, this was a studio with no role-playing game experience. And the sad part of this is supposedly Sumo Digital, bosses of the Chinese Room, they actually got the job because they promised that they could rush out the game in a short space of time. Really pure reasons there. Paradox were not focused on delivering a quality product at this stage. They were completely focused on recouping losses from the botched effort with Hardsuit Labs, and that to me is sad. If you're still going to release the game, please just focus on making it good. If it takes a bit longer, I know it's going to cost a little bit more money, but if it's a great RPG, people will play it, they'll buy it for years to come. Surely you would want that 20, 25 plus million copies sold like Baldur's Gate 3. That isn't going to happen with some rushed, pathetic effort. The game is due to release at the end of next year, and it has barely anything going for it. The devs can barely show any functional footage. They released these little 15-second gameplay snippets, which really show nothing. It is going to be rushed out the door. It is likely going to be an embarrassment to the original Bloodlines. It's a sad story that is completely at odds with Baldur's Gate 3. It's the exact opposite. As much as I don't like Hasbro, the company currently behind Dungeons & Dragons, they did give the game to a trusted RPG developer, a studio who has improved over time, creating the incredible Divinity series, which has recently peaked with the original Sin titles. They deserve to get the Baldur's Gate series. They were given the necessary time to master their craft, to not only gather feedback, but also be able to act on it, to ensure the scope of the game was that of a genuine epic, to polish the title with production values worthy of an all-time great. Avowed, Dragon Age Dreadwolf, Bloodlines 2, they aren't the only RPGs releasing next year, but they are some of the biggest or most well-known ones, and the landscape has simply changed. Starfield, it felt like the first of these sorts of titles to release post Baldur's Gate 3, where it was hyped up a little bit, but then it was hammered by fans for being a total letdown. It seemed like there was a period where devs could release a game, and if it had no microtransactions, no cash store, then gamers would go, yep, this is good enough. But that is no longer the case. RPG fans, they are no longer going to tolerate mediocrity. We expect the best. We expect our time to be respected. And the future of the genre is going to need to focus on how to generate genuine community goodwill. This is not a genre where mainstream success is achieved through flashy marketing campaigns or mainstream review scores. People will only listen and buy the game if their friends or player-driven communities recommend it. Companies who failed in their push for live services, they've come crawling back. They're trying to get a taste of that Elden Ring, Baldur's Gate 3-like success, but they are only going to get it if they produce quality. The games I've talked about today are unlikely to be quality, and we are realistically only going to get the next Baldur's Gate 3-like experience from looking elsewhere. There are hidden gems out there. There are still plenty of good games coming in 2024 and beyond, and I do look forward to supporting them. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you on the next one. Cheers. Bye.